The New Zealand story is known for being one of Taito's most iconic arcade platformers from the 1980s, along with other classics such as Bubble Bobble and Rainbow Island. This game got quite a few ports back in its heyday, such as the NES version, which is known as Kiwi Craze in the West, the Master System port that was PAL only, and the PC Engine port. It also got ports for home computers like the Amiga. Now, just about all of these ports have their own little quirks like you would expect from arcade ports back in that time period. However, the one port that is the weirdest of them all, and maybe one of the more unusual arcade conversions of any arcade game from this time period, is the Mega Drive version. Now, this port was only released in Japan in 1990, but that's not necessarily the weird thing here. So I'm going to break down what makes this port weird, the things it does have in common with its arcade counterpart, and I'll give my overall thoughts on it as a game and some strategies for 1-credit clears and speedruns, since I've done a 1-credit clear of this game recently. So what is it that makes this port so weird? Well, it's actually quite simple. It is a port of the arcade prototype of the original game. This means quite a few differences. First off, you have fewer stages. In the arcade version, you have 20 levels. In this port, you only have 13 of them. And on top of that, many of the stages have different layouts than the arcade original. The first 6 stages are almost unrecognizable, in fact. In terms of gameplay, it feels like there are more underwater sections early on. To make matters worse, your oxygen drains faster than in the original, which means you don't have much time to waste. When it comes to enemies, there are less of them, and hardly any ground enemies in particular. That sounds great until you realize that the developers kept the most annoying ones. In particular, most of the enemies that fly through the air. The spike guys are especially annoying, whether they be on the ground or in the air, as their hitboxes can sometimes poke through the thin walls, or even ceilings if they're flying on something. And sometimes they have a mind of their own too. I had a dumb death one time on stage 3-2 because I thought they were gonna jump and then they decided to just run into me. You also have flying porcupines on balloons that can sometimes spawn above you and then descend on top of you and kill you, especially if you're riding on the spike ball, which is very slow. And speaking of enemies, they seem to be more aggressive here overall as well, not taking long at all to go after you. So you have to be pretty aggressive in taking out enemies that spawn close to you in a lot of situations. I had a dumb death in the last stage of my 1-credit clear that I posted recently because the enemy started shooting when I simply didn't expect it. Tiki, the main character of the game, has some hitbox issues that are not present in the original. While the top of his head doesn't seem to count, the sides of his sprite have no forgiveness whatsoever, to the point where I would wonder whether the hitbox was slightly bugged. The one moment that sums up the hitbox perfectly is that one jump on stage 3-2 where the spikes are on the ceiling and on the floor, and you gotta get through that part. In the arcade version, you can just do a small hop, but in this version, you have to jump higher and have the top of your head touch the spikes on the ceiling to get through that section, because you have no forgiveness on the side of your hitbox. Otherwise, Tiki controls just fine on the ground, thankfully. He does have some problems in the air because the flying physics here seem a bit more touchy. For instance, you have a bad tendency to bounce off the walls quite a bit, which can get you in trouble. There is one key mechanic that is missing, and that is the Heaven stage. So in the arcade version, if you died on your last life in World 3 or later, you would be taken to a Heaven stage that you would have to get through in order to get back to the main game, giving you one more chance before using up a continue. This also allows you to skip certain areas. However, this mechanic is not here in the Mega Drive version. So now that we understand the key differences between this version and the original game, we still have some unanswered questions. The main one is, why did they port over the prototype version instead of porting over the arcade version? Weaker consoles like the Master System got more faithful ports than the Mega Drive did. Why couldn't Taito have done a more faithful port? There's almost no documentation out there about this version, but I do have a theory. I believe that Taito decided to cheap out on this version. The ROM size is only 512 kilobytes, making it a fairly small game for the 16-bit era. However, this was early on in the lifespan of the Mega Drive, and it would have been more expensive to manufacture a cartridge that could fit more data. So I think Taito cheaped out, and I think it also explains why this one did not get a release in the United States, despite it having all of the text in English. There is another related question about this version, and that is, who developed this version in the first place? There was a blog from years ago that correctly pointed out that, unlike other console ports, there is no specific team attributed to this one. If you look at the title screen, all it says is Taito Corporation at the bottom. And there are no credits after you beat the game. But if I had to bet money, I would say that this one was done in-house. The fact that it's based on a prototype makes me lean more toward that theory, and my theory about them cheaping out on this one in the first place makes more sense if they were doing it in-house. Now, it is possible that a company like Tosei could have done this port without being credited for it, but the truth is, we'll never know for sure. While there are plenty of quirks and questions about why the Mega Drive version is the way that it is, there are also plenty of similarities between this one and the arcade original. For one, the later stages from round 2-3 until the end are all present in the arcade version, but in a different number order than this port. The last stage is kind of interesting because the two halves of it are divided by a warp instead of being one whole stage, but otherwise the stage layout is pretty much identical. The three boss fights that are present in this version are also present in the original game, with some minor differences in terms of the attack patterns and movement. The stone octopus fight is not here though. A lot of the core mechanics are intact as well. The warps are a thing like in the arcade version, but you don't have as many of them here. You have the same vehicles, balloons, and other things that you can use to fly in the air. As mentioned before, the physics when flying tend to be a bit touchier and more sensitive to bouncing off the walls than in the original game. It is worth noting that the duck is a lot faster here, but quite touchy to control. But the duck can help you speed through certain sections and is more common than those spaceships are. You have the same weapon pickups available. Spelling out extend is still a thing as well, which will give you an extra life whenever you grab enough of the letters to spell it out. The checkpoint system is still here, and it's quite generous, spawning you almost exactly where you died in most cases. But at this point, you might be wondering, is this version worth playing? Yes. This is a solid game for the Sega Mega Drive, especially for 1990 before a lot of the heavy hitters like Sonic the Hedgehog were released. It looks great, very close to the arcade version in terms of the sprite work and backgrounds. The main difference here is that it's not quite as colorful due to the limited color palette that all Genesis and Mega Drive games had to work around. The music and sounds are pretty good, but the soundtrack was always kind of limited for the original to begin with. And honestly, despite all of the changes and quirks, this still feels like the New Zealand story overall. It actually feels like an arranged version of the game with different stage layouts, especially early on. Even people who have mastered the arcade version should be able to have some fun with this version. And because it's based on a prototype, it's neat to see what made it to the arcade game and what got tweaked or cut. And while Tiki does have some quirks with his hitbox and flying around, the actual platforming is mostly tight, which is what you want. This is also not the kind of game that you're going to beat in a day either. It's a decent challenge by platformer standards. You have limited continues, so even if you're not playing for a 1 credit clear, you cannot credit feed your way through it either. I like it overall. It's not a perfect port and it's a little bit weird, obviously, and that's putting it mildly, but there are far worse arcade ports out there from this time period. If you're a fan of the Sega Genesis, this is not a bad import game to have in your collection. Before I go, I do want to discuss high level play for this game, in particular going for 1 credit clears and speedruns. So far I've done 2 1 credit clears, one without using warps and one with warps. The latter is the one that I posted recently on the channel. The number 1 key to success in any version of this game, regardless of whether you're trying to do a 1 credit clear or a speedrun, is routing. Routing is crucial because this game is known for having maze-like stages, especially in this version where the stages are even more maze-like than usual. For instance, if you don't know where to swim in the early part of 1-4, you can die pretty easily. You also have to worry about the hidden time limit on each stage. This is especially true for the labyrinth that is round 3-3 in this version, which is 5-2 in the arcade game. If you run out of time, a Grim Reaper-like enemy will chase you down and kill you, so you need to keep moving. Speed killing is a thing as well. You'll want to do this for the boss fights. If you have the laser gun, they'll go down quickly, especially if you have auto fire. Keep in mind that you can touch enemies in this game unless they have spikes. This applies to the bosses as well. Be aware that you will have to do some pretty tough jumps that are almost pixel perfect. This game seems like having you jump from tiny square to tiny square. On the final stage, you'll even have to misdirect the bats from dropping spikes on you from those tiny squares. Thankfully, Tiki's movement and jumping are pretty good. When it comes to speedrunning in particular, you obviously need to use the warps. They always save time. However, because the heaven mechanic is missing, you cannot use that to skip areas like you would in the arcade version. That takes the double heaven strategy off the table involving suicides and continues, where you end up skipping large chunks of the game when combined with the warps. But in its place, there is another suicide strategy that works a bit differently, but saves a lot of time in this version. By suiciding near walls after you've triggered certain checkpoints, you can suicide in specific spots in order to respawn with the invulnerability frames and go through the walls, or ceilings, creating a shortcut through almost all of a stage in some cases. It even allows you to skip boss fights in the case of round 1-4 when done properly. Now you have to do this a lot and even use up continues, but the world record runs for this version of the game are around 7 to 8 minutes because of this and getting all the warps. Plus, it's not as easy of a glitch to pull off as it looks, as the respawn has to be right next to the wall or ceiling, and you have to be moving as the respawn happens. It takes a lot of practice to get the glitch to work right, but I did go back and do it on 1-4 just to demonstrate here for this video. But if you're speedrunning this port, this technique is a must. But anyways, that's all I've got to say about the New Zealand story on the Sega Mega Drive. Good game, but definitely an unusual port even for the 16-bit era. But what do you think? Did you play the New Zealand story growing up in arcades or on console? Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching and I'll see you again soon.